Entire civilizations vanished from the Mediterranean world in a single lifetime. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's most profound puzzles, and the answer lies not on land, but on the sea. This journey will give you a completely new understanding of how global networks can suddenly fail. We will follow the ancient maritime routes that once carried unimaginable wealth, connecting mighty empires from Egypt to Greece. How could the very sea lanes that built these kingdoms also become the instruments of their destruction? By the end, you will see the echoes of this ancient collapse in our own interconnected world. What does it feel like to watch a world you know disintegrate from the shores? The Mediterranean Sea was a liquid superhighway, pulsing with the lifeblood of empires. Gigantic oared ships, their sails billowing, cut through the blue waters, carrying fortunes in their holds. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms, but a single, sprawling network of incredible complexity. From the mines of Cyprus came the copper, a metal so vital it gave the age its name. From distant, almost mythical lands to the east came the tin needed to forge bronze, the alloy of power and progress. These two metals traveled thousands of miles by ship to meet in cosmopolitan ports like Ugarit, a city whose wealth was built entirely on trade, but the ships carried more than raw materials. They transported ivory from Egypt, fine pottery from Mycenaean Greece, and olive oil in beautiful clay jars. More importantly, they carried the ideas and technologies that bound these civilizations together. The naval prowess of the Minoans once dominated these waves, their thalassocracy, a word meaning sea empire, establishing the first major maritime trade routes. Later, the Mycenaeans took control, their fortified palaces looking out to sea, their economies entirely geared towards this aquatic exchange. The entire system functioned with a beautiful, terrifying fragility. Every major city, every palace, every king depended on the constant, predictable flow of goods across the water. The sea was their source of life, the maritime routes their circulatory system. What happens when a circulatory system is suddenly cut? The first signs of trouble would have been whispers in a busy port, a ship that failed to arrive on schedule, a trade delegation that never returned. The horizon, once a promise of wealth and connection, began to look strangely, ominously empty. That vital bronze alloy was nothing without tin, a metal so rare its very origins were shrouded in mystery. Think of tin as the secret ingredient, the essential component that transformed common copper into the hard, durable metal that built civilizations and armed their soldiers. Without it, the entire Bronze Age would have simply rusted into silence. The most powerful kings and merchants guarded the knowledge of tin sources like a state secret, because controlling this information meant controlling the very engine of their world. The journey of this metal was an epic in itself. It likely began in mines thousands of miles apart, from the rugged highlands of ancient Afghanistan to the misty shores of Cornwall in far-off Britain. From these distant points, small, precious consignments of tin would begin their long, slow trek towards the Mediterranean Sea. Once loaded onto ships, the real adventure began. These vessels, carrying a cargo more valuable than gold by weight, had to navigate a treacherous network of sea lanes. They would hop from one coastal outpost to the next, hugging the shore for safety, stopping at fortified ports like Cyprus to rest and resupply. This was the most strategic and vulnerable supply chain in the ancient world. The sheer distance involved created a staggering fragility. A drought in Central Asia, a war in Anatolia, or a storm in the Aegean could sever this thin, precious thread. And the immense value of the cargo made the ships floating targets. pirates and rival kingdoms watched these routes with hungry eyes, waiting for a moment of weakness. The entire system of empires, with their grand palaces and mighty armies, was built upon this one incredibly fragile lifeline stretching across the known world. What happens when a single, vital thread, stretched to its absolute limit, finally snaps? While tin traveled from distant, mysterious lands, copper had a single, dominant source. The island of Alashia, known today as Cyprus, was the undisputed copper capital of the Bronze Age world. Its very soil seemed to bleed the metal, fueling the forges of every major empire. Imagine the constant, thunderous sound of smelting furnaces along its coasts, the air thick with smoke as workers extracted the raw copper from ore. The harbors of cities like Nkomi and Kishon were never silent. Ships from Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean crowded the wharves, their crews loading heavy, gleaming ingots of copper in the distinctive shape of an ox hide, designed for easy transport. The wealth this generated was staggering. Archaeological digs at these sites reveal not just workshops and foundries, but luxurious palaces, homes filled with imported treasures, and sanctuaries adorned with gifts to the gods. This was a society built entirely on its control of a single, indispensable resource. Alashia was more than just a supplier. It was the very heart of the bronze-producing ecosystem. If its copper stopped flowing, the entire system would suffer a massive, instantaneous heart attack. Every sword, every tool, every piece of armor across the Mediterranean depended on the steady pulse of ships leaving its shores. This created a profound and dangerous vulnerability. The entire interconnected world had a single, glaring point of failure, and its name was Alashia. Its incredible wealth and power were entirely dependent on the security of the sea lanes it commanded. The island's fate was not its own, but was chained to the stability of the vast blue network that spread out from its ports. When that network began to fray, Alashia would be the first to feel the tremors, a king whose entire kingdom was built on a foundation of water. In the deep blue silence off the coast of Turkey, a ship from the height of the Bronze Age rests on the seabed. This is the Uluburun shipwreck, a time capsule from a world about to shatter. When archaeologists carefully excavated its remains, they uncovered more than just a sunken vessel. They found a perfect, preserved cross-section of the entire international system. The ship's hold was a treasure chest of globalized commerce. There were 10 tons of pure copper ingots from Cyprus, shaped like stretched ox hides for easy stacking. Alongside them lay a ton of precious tin, the exact ingredients needed to forge bronze for an entire army. But the cargo did not stop there. It held gleaming ebony wood from Africa, ivory tusks, vibrant cobalt blue glass from Mesopotamia, and fragrant resins. There were golden chalices, Baltic amber, and pottery from Mycenaean and Canaan. This single ship was a floating encyclopedia of its age, carrying the signature products of a dozen different cultures. We can trace its intended route with remarkable clarity. It likely set sail from a Levantine port, perhaps Canaanite, heading west towards the powerful Greek mainland. It was a diplomatic gift, a royal order, and a merchant venture all rolled into one, a direct line of exchange between palace centers. The Uluburun ship is irrefutable proof of the deep interdependence that defined this era. Here was a single vessel, crewed by a mix of cultures, physically linking the mines of Cyprus to the palaces of Greece and the workshops of the Near East. It is the system working perfectly, a beautiful, humming machine of exchange. This tangible evidence makes the coming collapse all the more haunting. We are not looking at abstract theories, but at the very real, sunken wreckage of a world that functioned, a world connected by threads of commerce just like our own. If a ship like this was the lifeblood of the age, then what kind of storm could stop its heart? The strength of Mycenaean sea power was etched into the very landscape. Their great palaces, like Mycenae and Pylos, were not built inland for safety, but perched on hills with commanding views of the sea. From these fortified centers, a network of watchful eyes monitored the maritime highways, controlling the flow of goods and information. Their fleets were the backbone of this control. These were not the simple trading vessels of earlier times, but powerful oared galleys, their prows often decorated with fierce eyes, designed for both commerce and combat. They were the multi-purpose tools of a maritime empire, capable of carrying priceless cargo one month and enforcing a king's will the next. We can hear the echoes of this sophisticated operation in the clay tablets they left behind. Written in a script called Linear B, these administrative records are the balance sheets of a palace economy utterly dependent on the sea. They meticulously list the resources needed to build and maintain a fleet, recording allocations of timber, linen for sails, and bronze for tools. They track the arrival of exotic imports, ivory and precious metals, and the distribution of essential raw materials to workshops across the kingdom. Every jar of olive oil exported, every shipment of copper unloaded, was counted and recorded by an army of scribes. This was a system of breathtaking complexity and centralization. The entire Mycenaean economy, from the warrior king in his Megaron hall to the artisan in his workshop, was geared towards this seaborne exchange. Luxury goods bolstered the prestige of the elite, while raw materials fueled the industries that sustained their power. Their maritime reach was the ultimate source of their wealth and authority, a pillar of civilization hewn from the sea itself. But a system so centralized, so meticulously documented, carries a hidden fragility. What happens when the ledgers can no longer predict the chaos beyond the horizon? For the pharaohs of Egypt, the port of Byblos was more than just a trading partner. It was a lifeline to the divine. The legendary cedars of Lebanon, towering trees that grew in the mountains just inland from this bustling port, were a resource unlike any other. Their wood was strong, fragrant, and incredibly durable, resistant to the insects and rot that plagued local timber. To the Egyptians, this cedar was not just a building material, it was sacred. It was used to construct the great solar barks, the ritual boats that carried the sun god Ra across the sky, and it was essential for the finest coffins and temple doors. The maritime route from the Nile Delta to Byblos, a journey so routine it was known as the Byblos Run, was the most important sea lane in the Egyptian world. It was their constant, reliable connection to a world of necessary luxuries and spiritual necessities. Archaeological evidence from Byblos itself reveals a city deeply entwined with Egypt. We find Egyptian-style artifacts, scarabs, and alabaster vessels, gifts from the pharaohs to secure the loyalty of the local rulers. The famous Amarna letters, a trove of diplomatic clay tablets, show the kings of Byblos writing directly to the Egyptian court, addressing the pharaoh as a brother and pleading for military support. This was not a relationship of equals, but it was a profoundly symbiotic one. Byblos thrived on Egyptian demand, and Egypt's civilization was literally built in part on Levantine wood. This deep connection to the sea, however, was balanced by an unshakable foundation on land. While the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites of Anatolia had economies dangerously concentrated on maritime trade, Egypt possessed the fertile, predictable Nile. Its agricultural base was a power source that never failed. This dual system, a vibrant maritime network combined with a secure, self-sufficient heartland, gave Egypt a resilience that other empires lacked. When the storm came, Egypt would be battered, but it would not break. Its survival offers a crucial clue in our mystery, a testament to the fact that in an interconnected world, the strongest node is the one with the deepest roots. The calm blue waters that once carried the wealth of empires now brought fire and terror. From the fringes of the known world, a new and frightening force surged across the Mediterranean, striking with a speed only the sea could grant. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III give them a collective name that has echoed through history: the Sea Peoples. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depicts a great naval battle, with Egyptian warships ramming and capsizing the vessels of these invaders, whose feathered headdresses and distinct round shields mark them as foreign and formidable. The records list their tribal names: the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, names that hint at origins scattered from the Aegean to Anatolia. But were these warriors simply organized pirates, or something far more complex? The evidence suggests they were less a unified army and more a desperate coalition of migrants, a tidal wave of humanity set in motion by the very systemic failures we have been tracing. They were not the cause of the collapse, but its ultimate symptom. They used the ancient maritime trade routes, the very superhighways of civilization, as their avenue of attack, turning the tools of connectivity into weapons of destruction. A trade ship carrying copper could be refitted as a troop transport. A familiar coastal landing point, once a haven for merchants, could become a beachhead for a raid. The Sea Peoples did not invent chaos, they simply exploited the pathways that prosperity had built. This is the final, terrifying transformation of the sea's role. The liquid highway that had pumped life into the kingdoms of the Bronze Age was now injecting them with a fatal poison. How did a network of trade become a network of ruin? And what does this tell us about the final, fatal unraveling of an entire world order? The same sea lanes that carried the wealth of kings now carried a new and ruthless kind of merchant. With the great naval powers of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites crumbling, their fleets no longer able to patrol the waters, the Mediterranean transformed almost overnight. The open sea, once a regulated superhighway, became a vast and lawless frontier. Piracy evolved from a sporadic risk into an organized and devastating enterprise. A merchant vessel setting sail from Cyprus with a hold full of copper ingots was no longer just battling the weather, it was running a gauntlet. The cost of this new danger was staggering. Insurance in its ancient form did not exist. A single lost ship could bankrupt a merchant family or a small city-state. To offset the immense risk, kings and traders had to invest in heavier escorts, hire more guards, and plot longer, secretive routes away from the coast. The price of every ingot of copper, every jar of oil began to skyrocket. This was not merely an economic problem, it was a systemic failure. The maritime network relied on trust and predictability. A Mycenaean palace expected its tin shipment from the east, just as an Egyptian temple relied on its cedar from Byblos. That trust evaporated. The clay tablets at Pylos and Ugarit show a growing desperation, records of shipments that never arrived and frantic messages sent to distant partners that went unanswered. Piracy did not just steal cargo, it severed the invisible threads of diplomacy and communication that held the entire Bronze Age world together. This created a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. As trade became more dangerous and less profitable, the central authorities grew poorer and weaker. As kings lost their revenue, they could no longer afford to maintain the very navies that had once kept the sea lanes safe. Their powerlessness invited even more piracy, which further choked off trade. The circulatory system of the Bronze Age was not just cut, it was systematically bled dry. How could any palace economy, no matter how wealthy, survive when its lifeblood simply stopped flowing? A silent, global shift was already underway. While kings bickered and pirates prowled, the very climate of the planet began to turn against the fragile Bronze Age world. Scientists now refer to this period as the 3.2 kiloyear event, a dramatic shift towards colder, drier conditions that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean. This was not a single bad storm, but a profound, multi-generational drought that starved the land to weaken the sea. The first and most direct impact was on the harvest. The great palaces of Mycenae and the Hittite Empire were not just trade hubs, they were massive redistribution centers that relied on agricultural surplus. Their wealth was grain, olives, and grapes. A succession of failed harvests meant no surplus. Without a surplus, there was nothing to tax. Without taxes, a king could not pay the scribes, could not feed the soldiers, and most critically, could not fund the shipyards. The construction of a single-oared galley required vast amounts of timber, rope, cloth, and skilled labor, all paid for by the agricultural wealth of the hinterlands. When the grain silos emptied, the royal dockyards fell silent, but the drought's reach extended far beyond the treasury. On land, desperate herders and farmers, their fields turning to dust, would have looked towards the coast. They saw the fortified port cities, the storehouses still holding the last remnants of wealth, and they began to move. This was the human fuel for the migrations we call the Sea Peoples, a slow avalanche of hunger and displacement that eventually reached the sea and took to ships. The climate crisis also reshaped the maritime world itself. Familiar sailing routes, dictated by centuries of predictable winds and currents, may have become treacherous or impassable. More frequent and violent storms would have made voyages even riskier, damaging port infrastructure and sinking ships far from shore. The environment became a force multiplier for every other problem. It strained the resources that funded trade, it created the desperate populations that became raiders, and it made the act of sailing itself a more deadly gamble. The collapse was not merely a story of human conflict, it was a story of human systems built for a stable world, suddenly buckling under the weight of a planet that had suddenly and decisively changed its mind. A single broken trade route could unravel an entire civilization. The fall of a distant port was not an isolated event. It was a tremor that sent shockwaves racing through the entire interconnected system. Think of the Bronze Age world not as a collection of separate kingdoms, but as a vast, intricate web. Each kingdom, each major port city, was a vital node in this web, and the maritime routes were the silken threads that connected them all. This was the first truly globalized economy, and its greatest strength became its ultimate weakness. When one thread snapped under the strain of piracy, drought, or invasion, the tension did not simply vanish. It transferred, overloading the neighboring nodes and causing them to fail in turn. This is what modern network theory calls a cascade failure. The loss of a key tin source in the east, for instance, would not just inconvenience a few Mycenaean metalworkers. It would create a desperate scarcity that drove up prices, incentivized more piracy on the alternate routes, and forced kingdoms to expend their dwindling resources on securing new, more dangerous suppliers. The failure would cascade from the metal market to the shipbuilding industry, to the royal treasuries, and finally to the armies who could no longer equip their soldiers. This domino effect explains the breathtaking speed of the collapse. A fire in a single warehouse in Ugarit could, through a chain of dependencies, help cause a famine in Greece and a political crisis in Egypt. The system was so tightly wound, so exquisitely tuned for efficiency during stable times, that it had no slack, no redundancy to absorb a major shock. There were no backup plans when the primary routes failed. This interdependence meant that a crisis was never local. A drought in Anatolia that weakened the Hittite Empire did not stay contained. It pushed displaced populations towards the coast, who then took to the sea as raiders, who then attacked the ships carrying grain to Greece. which in turn starved the palace economies that were the Hittites' own trading partners. The network, designed to circulate wealth, became lethally efficient at circulating catastrophe. The sea that had once carried promises of prosperity now carried a contagion of collapse, and every connected port was vulnerable to the infection. How does a civilization prepare for a disaster when the disaster is the very connectedness it worked so hard to build? The final words of a civilization were pressed into clay. In the fire-scorched ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists uncovered a set of tablets that were never sent. One is a frantic plea from the city's king to the governor of a nearby region. It reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships are coming. They have set fire to my cities and have done great damage in the country." The letter ends with a desperate question. "Can you not see that all your troops are stationed in chariotry, and that no ships are stationed near you? This is the sound of a world breaking." Ugarit was the quintessential Bronze Age trade hub, a cosmopolitan port city in modern-day Syria whose wealth was entirely maritime. Its excavated archives detail a vibrant, globalized economy, with records of trade deals spanning from Egypt to Anatolia to the Aegean. Its merchants dealt in purple dye, its warehouses were packed with imported goods, and its scribes documented a world of constant, predictable exchange. Then the horizon emptied. The final letters reveal a chilling sequence of events. First, the city's main fleet was away, possibly assisting the collapsing Hittite Empire to the north. Then, enemy ships appeared off its coast, likely the very sea peoples who exploited the now unpatrolled sea lanes. With its own navy absent and its allies either unable or unwilling to send aid, Ugarit was utterly defenseless from the sea. The maritime network that was its source of life became its avenue of death. The archaeological record confirms the catastrophe. The city was not just conquered, it was systematically burned and abandoned. The grand palaces and libraries were reduced to ash, the wealth of centuries looted or destroyed. The story of Ugarit is the grand collapse written small. It shows with painful clarity how a society built on maritime commerce could be extinguished in a single season when that commerce was violently, irrevocably severed. Here was a city that knew the world was falling apart, that sent its cries for help across a network that no longer functioned, a node in the web that went dark, leaving only silence and ash in its wake. The ash had not yet cooled when a new technology began to rise from the ruins. The great Bronze Age kingdoms had crumbled because their lifeblood, the tin and copper trade, was a single, fragile thread stretching across the world. But the collapse itself forged the solution. Iron, a metal that had been known for centuries but was difficult to work with, suddenly became the material of necessity. Unlike the rare and distant tin deposits, iron ore was astonishingly common. You could find it in hillsides and bogs across the Mediterranean, from Italy to Greece. This simple geological fact changed everything. The new metal did not require a 1,000-mile voyage to bring two separate ingredients together. A single source of ore, heated in a bloomery furnace, could produce a workable metal right there on the spot. The strategic importance of Cyprus and the distant tin routes evaporated almost overnight. The world no longer needed to depend on that perilous, interconnected web. This was a revolution born from the sea's failure. With the old maritime superpowers gone and piracy rampant, local self-sufficiency became the key to survival. A village on the coast of Anatolia or a new settlement in Phoenicia could now forge its own tools and weapons without begging a distant king for copper or waiting for a ship that might never arrive. This technological shift fundamentally rewired the ancient economy. The sea did not become irrelevant, far from it, but what sailed upon it began to change. Instead of a few powerful kings controlling the flow of strategic metals, a new class of merchants emerged, trading in diverse and smaller-scale goods. The Phoenicians, rising from the ashes of the collapsed Canaanite cities, became the new masters of the waves. Their ships carried not just metal, but purple dye, glass, wine, and most importantly, ideas. They established trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to ports in Spain, creating a new, more resilient and decentralized network. The legacy of the Bronze Age maritime routes is not found in their continuity, but in the profound lesson they taught the world. Their catastrophic failure demonstrated the ultimate vulnerability of a hyper-specialized, centralized system. The new Iron Age world that emerged was messier, more diverse, and far less centralized. Power was no longer concentrated in a few grand palaces dependent on one another, but spread among many smaller city-states and new nations. The sea remained the great connector, but the nature of the connection had been forever altered. The collapse was not an end, but a brutal, world-shattering reset. It proved that from the wreckage of one globalized order, the seeds of another, built on the hard-learned lessons of the past, could always take root. These sailors charted their course by the heavens themselves, without a magnetic compass or any map beyond memory and experience. They navigated the vast, featureless blue by reading the sky and the sea with an intimacy we can barely comprehend. By day, the sun was their primary guide. They understood its arc across the sky, using its position at noon to judge their latitude, their north-south position. At night, a more precise map unfolded. They knew the constellations, the fixed patterns of stars that rotated predictably through the seasons. The North Star, Polaris, was their anchor in the northern sky, a nearly motionless point around which the entire celestial sphere turned, giving them a constant bearing of true north. This was not abstract astronomy, it was a practical, life-saving skill. A captain steering from Cyprus to the Egyptian delta would know which stars to keep on his left hand as he sailed south, and which new constellations would appear on the horizon when he was nearing his destination. When land was within reach, a different set of skills took over, a practice known as piloting. They read the coastline like a book, a distinctive mountain peak, the specific color of a cliff face, the unique shape of a river mouth, all served as crucial signposts. But their knowledge went even deeper beneath the waves. By lowering a weighted line, they could bring up a sample of the seabed. The difference between soft mud, coarse sand, or broken shells told them exactly where they were, even in thick fog or on a moonless night. They observed the flight patterns of seabirds. A certain species flying out to sea in the morning would invariably return to land in the evening, showing a skilled mariner the direction of the nearest unseen shore. This profound, accumulated knowledge transformed the terrifying emptiness of the sea into a familiar, navigable highway. This expertise was a form of closely guarded power. The secrets of navigation were not written down but held in the minds of specialized pilots and seasoned captains, passed from father to son or from master to apprentice through years of perilous voyages. This was the human software that ran the hardware of the maritime network. The entire flow of copper, tin, and luxury goods depended on this living, breathing repository of wisdom. In a stable world, this system worked beautifully, but what happened when that world fractured? In the chaos of the collapse, this fragile chain of knowledge would have been catastrophically broken. A master navigator killed in a coastal raid, a trading family wiped out, a port city burned with all its experienced sailors. Each was a tragedy that also erased a piece of the collective mental map. The loss of a single ship was an economic blow, but the loss of the knowledge of how to safely sail a route was a permanent severing of a thread in the network. The collapse was not just about burned cities and sunken ships. It was also about the silent extinguishing of light, the forgotten stars that once guided the world. The open sea was a realm of gods, not just merchants. For these ancient sailors, every voyage was a prayer, every successful landing a miracle granted by powers far greater than any king. The Egyptians saw the sun god Ra himself sailing a celestial bark across the sky each day, a divine mirror of their own journeys on the water below. This was not mere poetry, it was a fundamental truth that shaped their entire relationship with the maritime world. The sea was not an empty highway, it was a living, breathing, and often wrathful spiritual entity. Before a ship laden with copper ingots could set sail from Cyprus, rituals would be performed at the water's edge. Offerings were made to Poseidon, known to the Greeks as the Earth Shaker, a god whose goodwill meant calm passage and whose anger could summon a storm to shatter a fleet. The sailing season itself was dictated by this divine calendar. Mariners largely avoided the open Mediterranean during the winter months, not just for practical reasons of weather, but because that was when the gods were considered to be restless or asleep, leaving the sea in a state of dangerous, unpredictable chaos. These beliefs were a direct response to the terrifying realities of seafaring. The myths they created served as psychological maps for navigating a world of immense uncertainty. The story of Odysseus battling monsters and temptations on his long voyage home is a masterful allegory for the actual perils a captain would face, from the seductive danger of a hidden sandbar to the monstrous waves that could devour a ship. The sirens, whose beautiful song lured sailors to their doom on the rocks, represent the very real, fatal temptation to take a risky shortcut along an unfamiliar coast. Every whirlpool in a story could be a warning about a known treacherous current, and every sea monster a way to give form to the primal fear of the deep, dark unknown beneath the hull. This spiritual dimension was woven into the very fabric of Bronze Age commerce. A merchant did not just check the wind and the waves, he consulted omens and made sacrifices. The success of a trading mission was as dependent on divine favor as it was on the skill of the navigator. The wealth unloaded at a port was seen not just as profit, but as a blessing from the gods who ruled the routes. To separate the economic from the religious is to misunderstand this world entirely. The ship was both a warehouse and a temple, its journey a sacred pilgrimage across a landscape of myth and danger. How does our understanding of this collapse shift when we realize that it was not just an economic network that failed, but an entire spiritual universe that sank beneath the waves? Their walls rose directly from the water's edge, a testament to both their wealth and their profound vulnerability. Great harbor cities like Troy, Gaza, and Nkomi were the glittering, cosmopolitan linchpins of the entire Bronze Age network. They were not just cities by the sea, they were cities of the sea, their very identities and existence forged by the maritime routes they served. Their intricate infrastructure was a marvel of ancient engineering, designed for one purpose: to manage the constant, pulsing flow of global commerce. Long stone quays reached into the harbors, providing berths for ships from a dozen different cultures. Behind them stood vast, fortified warehouses, their cool, dark interiors stacked high with copper ingots, amphorae of olive oil, and sacks of precious grain. The air would have been a cacophony of languages, the scent of salt and spices mingling with the smell of cedar and sweat. These cities were the ultimate crossroads, where a merchant from Mycenae could barter with an Egyptian official and a Hittite diplomat, all under the watchful eyes of local kings grown rich on taxes and tariffs. Their defensive walls, often massive and imposing, were a clear admission of their greatest weakness. All their wealth, all their power was concentrated right at the waterline, accessible and exposed to anyone who could command a ship. This made them the most sensitive nerve endings of the Bronze Age world. They were the first to feel any tremor in the system, the first to grow feverish when the economic or environmental climate shifted. A single season of poor trade, a rumor of pirates, or a drought that reduced agricultural surplus would immediately ripple through their markets and palaces. When the Great Collapse began, these harbor cities became the primary targets. An attacker did not need to march an army across a continent to strike at the heart of an empire. They simply had to follow the same sea lanes the merchants used, appearing suddenly on the horizon to storm a waterfront that had been built for welcome, not for war. The destruction of a city like Ugarit or Nkomi was not just the fall of a kingdom, it was the equivalent of snipping a critical wire in a vast machine. With these nodes extinguished, the flow of information, goods, and security simply stopped. The route still existed on the water, but there was nowhere left to sail, no one left to trade with. The network did not slowly decay, it was severed at its most critical points, proving that to kill a globalized system, you simply need to attack its connected hearts. The clay tablets of Ugarit reveal an economy pulled in two directions. On one hand, we see the heavy hand of the palace, its scribes meticulously recording royal monopolies on the most vital commodities like copper and tin. These materials were the strategic reserves of the state, funding armies and securing diplomatic alliances. The king's own ships, bearing his seal, carried these goods on official missions, their voyages planned in the heart of the royal administration. Yet right alongside these state records, we find a bustling world of private enterprise, independent merchants, often operating on a surprisingly large scale, traded in everything from textiles and olive oil to slaves, forming complex partnerships and taking out loans to finance their ventures. This was not a simple command economy, but a delicate dance between palatial power and private ambition. The system's resilience depended entirely on this balance. When the palace was strong, it provided the security and stability that allowed private trade to flourish across the Mediterranean. Its navies policed the sea lanes, and its diplomatic agreements guaranteed safe passage for merchants of all kinds. But this created a hidden fragility. The entire edifice of commerce, both royal and private, rested upon the unshakable authority of the king and his palace. Everything was centralized around that one powerful institution. So what happened when the palace itself was threatened? The collapse did not begin with the destruction of every ship or the death of every merchant. It began with the failure of the central authority that made their world possible. When a palace like Pylos was burned, it was not just a king who fell. The entire administrative machine that funded shipbuilding, negotiated trade treaties, and suppressed piracy vanished in the smoke. The royal trade routes evaporated instantly. But what of the private merchants? They were left in a terrifying limbo. Their contracts, their debts, their very legal protections were inscribed on tablets in a palace that was now a ruin. The security once provided by the king's fleet was gone, replaced by the very pirates it had once kept at bay. A decentralized network might have adapted, with merchants finding new partners and new routes. But in the highly centralized Bronze Age world, private enterprise was a vine that had grown up around a single, mighty tree. When that tree was felled, the vine was left exposed and vulnerable, unable to support its own weight. The economic landscape shattered into 1,000 pieces, with no central power to glue them back together. This ancient tension between control and freedom echoes through the ages, a stark reminder that the structure of an economy can determine its fate in a crisis. The Amarna letters give us a direct line into the boardrooms of the Bronze Age. Found in the abandoned capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten, these 380 clay tablets are the diplomatic cables of their day, a frantic and formal correspondence between the kings of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and the rulers of powerful city-states like Byblos and Ugarit. Their language is one of brotherhood and bitter complaint, and the subject is often the sea. A king writes to his brother, the pharaoh, to complain that a promised shipment of gold has not arrived, his merchant ships delayed by storms or perhaps by the negligence of a distant port official. Another letter urgently requests safe passage for a diplomatic envoy traveling by ship along the coast, a plea for protection in waters that were growing increasingly lawless. The gifts they exchanged were not merely tokens of friendship, they were the lifeblood of their alliance. A pharaoh might send a shipment of gold, ebony, and linen to the Hittite king, not just as a generous present, but as a tangible symbol of the economic and maritime power he commanded. In return, he would expect equally lavish gifts, perhaps silver, horses, or precious oils, all transported across the same sea lanes that carried the copper and the tin. This was a delicate dance of reciprocity, all facilitated by the trusted captains and ships that served as the couriers of kings. The safe and timely arrival of a diplomatic gift was as much a sign of a healthy relationship as the words written on the tablet. When a ship carrying such treasures was lost to pirates or storm, it was not just a financial loss, it was a diplomatic incident. The network of great kings functioned like an exclusive club, and their shared control of the maritime routes was the membership fee. This system of high-stakes diplomacy was entirely dependent on the same vulnerable infrastructure as their economies. The very ships that carried their pleas for help and their promises of alliance were the ones being targeted by the rising chaos. So when the letters from the kings of Cyprus and Canaan to the Egyptian court suddenly stop, the silence is deafening. It is not just that trade has collapsed, but that the very language of international relations has been extinguished. The diplomatic sea lanes fell silent, and in that silence you can hear the final bonds of the Bronze Age world snapping one by one. The horizon remained empty, and the great sea roads fell silent. In the Aegean, the world shrank to the size of a single valley. This was the Greek Dark Ages, a 400-year twilight where the vibrant, interconnected world of the Mycenaeans vanished into memory. The grand palaces like Pylos and Mycenae were not just damaged, they were abandoned, their great halls open to the sky, the art of writing lost entirely. The archaeological record speaks of a profound maritime retreat. The distinctive, fine-painted pottery of the Mycenaeans, once a major export, disappears. In its place, we find simpler, purely functional vessels made for local use, not for trade across the waves. Entire coastal settlements were deserted, their populations moving inland to more easily defended hills, turning their backs on a sea that now promised only danger. The long-distance trade routes to Egypt and the Levant, those threads of copper and tin, were not just frayed, they were cut. The world became a collection of isolated villages, their horizons limited by the next ridge of hills, their economies reduced to simple subsistence. This was not a pause, it felt like an end, but within this deep quiet, a necessary recalibration was taking place. The old system, with its hyper-centralized palace economies and fragile, far-flung supply chains, had catastrophically failed. The collapse forced a hard reset. Society simplified, but it also became more self-reliant. The old hierarchies of warrior kings and scribes gave way to smaller, more communal forms of leadership. The technology of ironworking, no longer dependent on distant tin mines, slowly took root, empowering local smiths and farmers. This period of isolation was the crucible in which the seeds of the future were sown. The grand, interconnected world of the Bronze Age was gone, but in its place, a new, more resilient identity was being forged in the quiet villages of Greece. From this localized, inward-looking era would eventually emerge the city-states of classical Greece, with their new maritime ethos built not on royal monopolies, but on the daring of independent citizens. The darkness was not a tomb, but a long, quiet gestation. Centuries later, another interconnected world would crumble along its stone-paved roads. The fall of the Roman Empire echoes the Bronze Age collapse with an unnerving familiarity. Rome's power was not just in its legions, but in the incredible network of roads that bound its territories together. These roads moved troops, food, and information with an efficiency the ancient world had never seen, much like the maritime routes of the Bronze Age. Yet when barbarian invasions, political instability, and economic inflation struck simultaneously, that same network carried crisis to every province. The roads that had unified the empire now accelerated its fragmentation, as local regions found they could no longer depend on a collapsing center. The parallel is stark. In both cases, the very infrastructure designed for integration became a vector for disintegration when the system was overloaded. The Maya of Central America present another haunting variation on this theme. Their civilization, though not connected by sea, was bound by a complex web of trade routes, ceremonial pathways, and political alliances between powerful city-states. Their collapse, likely triggered by prolonged drought and intensified warfare, saw these connections wither. The intricate calendar systems and grand architectural projects ceased as the network of knowledge and resource exchange broke down. Just as the Bronze Age kingdoms depended on Cypriot copper, the Maya centers depended on a fragile ecological and social balance. When that balance was lost, the entire interconnected system fell in upon itself. What these collapses share is a dangerous convergence of stressors. It is rarely one single cause. For the Bronze Age, it was piracy, drought, and invasion. For Rome, it was invasion, inflation, and political decay. For the Maya, it was drought, war, and resource depletion. In each case, a complex, specialized system was hit by multiple, simultaneous shocks from different directions. The system's greatest strength, its deep interdependence, became its fatal flaw. The failure in one area, like a tin supply route, would cascade into others, like shipbuilding and royal authority, creating a feedback loop of collapse that was impossible to stop. This comparative view reveals a universal lesson about resilience. A system that is highly efficient and specialized is often deeply fragile. The Bronze Age world, with its single source of tin and centralized palace economies, was a masterpiece of efficiency for its time. But it had no redundancy, no backup plan. When the maritime routes failed, there was no plan B. The societies that survived, like Egypt, were those with a more diverse foundation, a strong agricultural base to fall back on when the sea-based trade collapsed. Our own modern world, with its digital networks and global supply chains, mirrors these ancient patterns in profound ways. We have built a system of incredible complexity and interdependence, one that moves information instead of copper ingots. The sea lanes of our time are the fiber optic cables on the ocean floor and the shipping container routes that carry the physical goods of our civilization. The same principles apply. A disruption in one part of the globe can now trigger economic and social shocks thousands of miles away in a matter of hours. The ancient maritime routes show us that connectivity is a double-edged sword. It builds wealth and spreads knowledge with a speed that can feel like magic, but it also builds in a vulnerability to cascading failure. The lesson of the Bronze Age is not to retreat from interconnection, but to understand its inherent risks. How do we build networks that are robust, not just efficient? How do we create systems that can bend without breaking when the next great convergence of stressors inevitably arrives? A ghost ship from the Bronze Age and a stranded container vessel in the Suez Canal are separated by 3,000 years, yet they tell the same story. Our modern world is built upon a maritime network of staggering scale, where colossal container ships have replaced the oared galleys of old, carrying the lifeblood of our global economy. The copper ingots of Cyprus have their equivalent in the semiconductors and manufactured goods filling these metal boxes, while the ancient tin routes are mirrored by a handful of narrow, vital choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Strait, and the Suez Canal are the modern equivalents of the strategic sea lanes around Cyprus, the very arteries that keep our world running. A single ship blocking the Suez Canal, as we saw with the Ever Given, does not just delay one shipment. It triggers a cascade of delays and shortages across the planet, demonstrating in real time how a single point of failure can threaten the entire system. The intricate dance of just-in-time manufacturing, where components arrive from multiple continents mere hours before they are needed on an assembly line, is as finely tuned and fragile as the palace economies of Mycenaean Greece. Both systems sacrifice redundancy for breathtaking efficiency, creating a house of cards where the removal of one piece can bring the whole structure down. Our vulnerability to a disruption in these sea lanes is not a future possibility, it is a present-day reality. A geopolitical crisis, a major storm intensified by climate change, or an act of piracy in a critical strait could sever these threads as decisively as the sea people severed the ancient tin routes. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not locked in the distant past. It is a blueprint, a stark warning etched in fire and clay. It forces us to confront a difficult question about our own globalized civilization. Have we, in our pursuit of maximum efficiency and connectivity, built a new Bronze Age, one whose incredible prosperity is just as precariously balanced on the same treacherous blue foundation? Understanding how an ancient network failed is the first step toward building a modern one that can endure. The silent testimony of a single clay jar can rewrite our entire understanding of the past. Modern archaeology no longer relies solely on grand ruins or golden treasures. Instead, it listens to the whispers of the deep and the subtle signatures left in the earth. Underwater archaeology has become our time machine, allowing us to walk the decks of sunken ships like the Uluburun without ever raising them from their watery graves. Advanced photogrammetry creates stunning three-dimensional maps of these wrecks, letting us explore a collapsed cargo hold from every angle on a computer screen, piecing together the final moments of a voyage that ended 3,000 years ago. Beyond the sea, satellites orbiting high above the Earth scan the surface for clues. They can detect subtle differences in soil moisture and vegetation growth, revealing the outlines of long silted harbors and forgotten coastal settlements now far inland. These are the ghost ports of the Bronze Age, their locations lost to history until viewed from space. Back in the laboratory, science performs its own kind of magic. Residue analysis involves studying the microscopic traces left inside pottery. A seemingly empty jar that once held olive oil can be identified by its chemical fingerprint, telling us not just what was traded, but the specific agricultural regions it came from. We can now trace the journey of a single amphora from a grove in Greece to a kitchen in Cyprus. Each of these techniques acts as a separate lens, bringing a blurry picture into sharp focus. A recent discovery off the coast of Israel revealed a shipwreck carrying a cargo of tin and copper ingots identical to those on the Uluburun, but from a slightly later period. This tells us the trade did not stop abruptly, but struggled on in a diminished, more desperate form even as the world was falling apart. Another team, using genetic analysis, identified the source of elephant ivory found in a Levantine tomb as originating from a specific herd in Syria, proving the existence of overland routes that fed into the maritime network. Every one of these finds is a new piece of the grand puzzle. They confirm the incredible complexity of this ancient globalization, while also highlighting its specific choke points and vulnerabilities. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not locked in a textbook. It is being written and rewritten with every storm that shifts the sands and every new technology we develop. The seafloor still holds countless secrets, and the next great discovery could be waiting just beneath the next wave, ready to challenge everything we think we know about the downfall of these first great civilizations. A storm-tossed sailor clings to the wreckage of his ship, washed ashore on an island of unimaginable wonders and terrors. This scene from the Egyptian tale of the shipwrecked sailor is not just a fantastical story. It is a profound echo of the very real fears and hopes of every Bronze Age mariner. The myths that have come down to us, from Homer's epic Odyssey to this Egyptian narrative, are far more than fiction. They are the cultural DNA of a seafaring civilization, preserving the texture of lived experience long after the palaces had turned to dust. The one-eyed Cyclops that Odysseus encounters may not have been a literal monster, but he represents a terrifying reality for ancient sailors, the dangerous, unknown inhabitants of foreign coasts who are hostile to strangers. The enchanting sirens whose song lured men to their doom perfectly embody the very real peril of being seduced by a calm, inviting shoreline that concealed deadly, ship-shattering rocks. These stories are not historical records, but they are historical reflections. They are the collective memory of a people whose lives were defined by the sea, distilled into powerful, enduring archetypes. The entire journey of Odysseus can be read as a navigational manual of fears, a map of the psychological and physical hazards that line the maritime routes of the Bronze Age. The whirlpool of Charybdis mirrors the terrifying hydraulic forces found in certain straits, while the clashing rocks of the Symplegades could be a mythic retelling of the treacherous, narrow passages that tested a captain's nerve. These tales gave a name and a shape to the formless dangers of the deep, transforming the random violence of a storm into a contest with an angry god. They provided a framework for understanding a world of immense uncertainty. When a ship vanished without a trace, it was not simply lost, it had been taken by a sea monster or had offended Poseidon. This mythological lens gave meaning to the seemingly meaningless tragedies of the sea. By decoding these stories, we gain access to something archaeology can never fully provide: the human heartbeat behind the bronze ingots and clay tablets. We hear the awe of a sailor seeing the towering cedars of Lebanon for the first time, which might have inspired tales of magical forests. We feel the disorientation of landing on a strange shore, an experience that fuels every story of an enchanted isle. The myths preserve the emotional landscape of the maritime world, the wonder mixed with sheer terror that defined life on the liquid highway. They remind us that the collapse was not just an economic or political event, it was a shattering of this entire universe of meaning, a world where gods ruled the waves and every voyage was an epic in the making. What echoes of that lost world still resonate in our oldest stories, and what truths about our own fears do they continue to hold? Their ghostly fingerprints are still visible on the blueprints of history. The most enduring legacy of the Bronze Age mariners is not the gold they traded, but the ships they built and the ports they engineered, a foundation that would shape the Mediterranean for the next 1,000 years. Look closely at the very first Phoenician trading vessels, the ones that would later establish colonies from Carthage to Cadiz, and you will see the direct descendant of the Bronze Age oared galley. The basic design, a sleek wooden hull powered by a square sail and banks of oarsmen, was a proven formula for navigating the capricious inland sea. The Phoenicians did not invent this from nothing. They inherited it, refining a template that had been tested and perfected during the age of copper and tin. Even the iconic Piracy, a warship with 2 levels of oars that would become the backbone of Greek and Roman navies, finds its conceptual roots in the multi-oared galleys depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings from the height of the Bronze Age. The knowledge of how to carve a keel from a cedar log, how to stitch a hull with tight cordage, or how to weave a sail that could catch the Mediterranean winds, this hard-won wisdom did not vanish in the collapse. It retreated into small, surviving coastal communities, passed down from one generation of shipwrights to the next in a fragile but unbroken chain. The great harbor engineering of the Bronze Age also set a lasting precedent. The concept of a protected port with man-made breakwaters and stone quays was first realized in cities like Nkomi on Cyprus. This was a revolutionary idea to tame the coastline itself to serve commerce and naval power. The Phoenicians and later the Greeks would adopt and massively expand upon this concept, building the legendary harbors of Tyre, Athens, and Alexandria. These were not new inventions, but the glorious maturation of an ancient idea. The most profound legacy, however, is not a piece of technology, but a concept. The Bronze Age mariners were the first to truly envision the Mediterranean not as a barrier of terrifying emptiness, but as a connective bridge. Their voyages, risky and monumental, created the very idea of a unified cultural sphere. They proved that disparate lands could be linked by shared trade, shared technologies, and shared stories. This vision of a connected sea was temporarily lost in the darkness that followed the collapse, but the template had been etched permanently into the collective memory of the region. When the Phoenicians and Greeks later burst forth in their own ages of exploration, they were not discovering a new world, they were rediscovering an old one. They were sailing in the wake of ghosts, following sea roads first charted by those forgotten Bronze Age captains. Their courage opened the world, and their greatest gift was the map they left behind, not on parchment, but in the very DNA of Mediterranean civilization. Our voyage ends with a profound truth whispered by the ancient waves. The maritime routes of the Bronze Age gifted the world with its first golden age of globalization, a symphony of cultures playing in harmony across the sea. Yet this very connectivity contained the seeds of its own destruction. When the climate shifted, when desperate migrants took to ships, and when piracy choked the life from the trade lanes, that same network amplified every shock. The sea, a bringer of life, became a perfect conduit for collapse. This is the enduring paradox they left for us. Interconnection is a power that builds civilizations, but it is also a peril that makes them exquisitely fragile. Our modern world, bound by digital highways and global supply chains, stands on a similar precipice. We have built a new Bronze Age, more complex and far-reaching than the last. The story of these ancient sailors is not a relic, it is a mirror. It urges us to look at our own web of dependencies and ask a critical question. Are we building systems that are merely efficient, or are we building systems that are truly resilient? Let this ancient collapse be our compass. As we navigate our own uncertain future, may we remember to weave strength and flexibility into the very fabric of our connected world. Thank you for joining this journey across the deep waters of time. If these echoes of ancient voyages resonated with you, we invite you to continue the exploration. Share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community for more journeys into the